So I'm excited. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get rolling.
Okay. All right. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells, where we interview top scholars and authors to help you rediscover the Bible on its own terms. What is the law of Moses? How do I, as a modern Christian, respond to the Torah and the commands in the Old Testament? These questions are going to be explored in this fascinating episode as we welcome aboard author, pastor, and professor Paul Sloan. Paul got his PhD at the University of St. Andrews and is now associate professor of early Christianity at Houston Christian University. Paul has authored multiple books, including Mark 13 and The Return of the Shepherd, and the book we will be discussing today, Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospel and the Restoration of Israel within first century Judaism. This book traces the synoptic Gospels in search of Jesus' true response and relationship to not only the Torah, but the Torah observant Pharisees who constantly came up against his ministry. Today, we will explore fascinating stories in the Bible and ask foundational questions that will rightly direct our course towards the truth of the narrative of Scripture. Buckle up and get excited. This is going to be a fascinating interview as we explore Jesus and how we all relate to the law of Moses. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show with me today, author and pastor Paul Sloan. And the crowd goes wild.
That's a great intro.
Well, truly, it is an honor to have you on the show. I'm excited for this conversation. Really am excited. And for the work that you put into this book. So thank you so much for writing this insightful book. And Paul, for taking the time to be with us here today.
I'm so grateful for the invitation. Thank you.
All right. So to kick us off, I want to talk about why you wrote this book. It's not hard for someone to pick up on the passion and the zeal that you have for how many modern teachings pit Jesus and the Apostle Paul somehow against the law and the desire to follow it faithfully. So I could pick up on this as I was reading through. I was like, this guy is really passionate about this, and I love that. That's why you wrote the book. I even heard you say in another interview that people just kept hearing you talk about this, and they were like, hey, write a book. So I'd love for you to tell us, where did this passion come from and why you chose to write this wonderful book?
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks, Jason. I've always just loved the Bible. I should start there. I've just loved the Bible. I've always loved learning more about it, learning context, learning things about it that I didn't know before. And also just in terms of theologically, big questions I've always have had to do with issues of, continuity that seems to speak quite meaningfully to us about sort of the purposes of God. If is the God of the Old Testament the same as the New, or do his purposes change, and all that sort of stuff. And then once you're asking those questions about continuity, of course, law is going to come up pretty quick because for perhaps obvious reasons, in the New Testament in particular, because of some passages that sound like, well, now there's this big change and it's not. And so just trying to think through some of those issues. And also, of course, I mean, I do think, I mean, I'm not saying this as if this is unique to me. Obviously, all theological traditions would agree with some version of this statement, but that we recognize that sort of God desires our commitment and obedience to him. And of course, once you're talking about commitment and obedience, of course, pretty quickly, issues again of law and Torah are going to come up because they're wrapped up with that. And so you combine some of those sort of pastoral, actually, I said theological, but really, I mean, pastoral as well, pastoral and theological questions and interests, then turning on to just the fact that, I was introduced to just really interesting work, first through David Moffat about sort of sacrifice and sacrificial ritual, and then through him to scholars who just, through him to scholars like Jacob Milgram and others who just were, talking about particular laws, and particularly, of course, ritual impurity and other things like that, in a way that I just thought, oh, this is all new information to me, and or at least I haven't heard it put this way, and then combine that with just my love of the Gospels and seeing that some of those issues intersect pretty deeply with Jesus's dialogue with the Pharisees, and it just kind of became this perfect storm of like, all right, well, here are all these big things: continuity, law, obedience, ritual purity, all these interesting sort of just biblical studies and pastoral theological questions that combined into a work like this.
Yeah, well, it's there. I mean, it seems like there was something, I could be wrong, but like that was underneath, like that you were like, wow, this is almost like an injustice that you saw, and it just kind of came out, and I appreciated it anyways, that there was, that there was you had this idea that you needed to get out, and it was apparent in the book.
Well, and thanks for saying that. And you mentioned the injustice. I mean, something I haven't mentioned yet in this podcast, and actually, particularly oddly enough, not a lot of others interviews has been, seeing the injustice in the way that people will describe Jews, Judaism, and Pharisees. I just, that does bother me. I think it's just historically, or sorry, it's of course wrong for lots of reasons now, because there are Jews and who practice Judaism are like, hey man, you're describing our own stuff to us in ways that we don't agree with, and so that was, it is frustrating. And then going back to just the biblical studies topic, I thought, I think there's a lot of misdescription going on here about Jews, Judaism, the law, and the Pharisees that are importantly being put to work in a person's exposition of Jesus. And then I thought, if you're misrepresenting those, you're actually also, that's bad on its own right, you're also consequently going to be misrepresenting Jesus, because you've now defined where the fault lines are, and you're going to read that stuff in material in a certain way. So anyway.
No, I love that. And I think what you're saying is that our understanding of the Torah, the law, and Jesus's relationship to it is foundational to who we are as Christians and how we make all these other theological decisions and just interpretations of the Bible. And I would echo that. And I think that's very important. So it seems that inside scholarship, we skip over these foundational questions a lot. We go straight to the deep end of the pool without ever asking the simple questions. So today, and in a lot of my episodes, I like to do this, to just pause early and let's ask some simple questions that really, like you talked about, are foundational for kind of understanding everything else. The first question that I want to address is to understand what the Hebrew Bible is and what the law is and how they correlate with each other. So I talked to you beforehand. We've got a few short clips that I prepared from the Bible Project that are going to go over these basic questions and give us some discussion that we can go over. So I'm going to share this one first from the Bible Project, going over the Torah. We're going to watch, and then we'll discuss. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, the list goes on.
And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah.
Now, the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of the law?
Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment.
So walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled.
So the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws, they're about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality. And by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like.
Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just the complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel?
No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel.
Yeah, don't worship other gods, don't make idols.
And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws.
Yeah, they worship the golden calf.
And so Moses gives some more laws, and then you get more stories of rebellion. Some more laws, rebellion again, some more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point.
Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart.
Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story.
So that was a rich and full clip, but I want to just specify that what I was trying to get out of that is for our understanding of how the Torah and the Hebrew Bible connect. Is it a story or is it a rule book? Is the narrative of Scripture different from the Torah or the Law of Moses? So answer to those questions and kind of respond to that clip.
Yeah, so I'm big fan of the Bible Project, and I know I've kind of kept up with their podcast over the years. I think there'll probably be little tiny X's and O's where I say something differently, but by and large, I agree. Like what the text of scriptures is doing, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, is it's obviously genre wise, it's not always story, right? It's law code or a prophetic text or a psalm book or other things, but also it through those distinct genres, it tells this sort of it tells this story of, as the clip mentioned, and as you've recognized, that the story of God and his interaction with his covenantal agreement with this particular people, Israel, and through them, the nations in different ways, but that within that particular story, they are singled out and are given commandments, as they put it in the clip, that I think is right, sort of like their covenantal, like, constitution, right? And that these commandments do more than one thing. They do distinguish Israel, qua Israel, but they also, in some texts you'll see, like I think it's Deuteronomy 40, they demonstrate the wisdom of the God that they worship. And so I don't think I wouldn't want to be committed to is it this or is it that, right? It's clearly at one level it's both. I think the commandments occur within the context of a broader sort of macro story. I think I'd be happy to say that. And of course, right. I mean, if the question is, okay, is the Hebrew Bible a rule book? Well, then the answer is no. It's got rule books in it, and it's got lots of rules scattered here and there, but it's predominantly sort of the description of God's purposes for his creation and Israel and the nations and his own acts throughout history that reveal and move those purposes forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's good to emphasize that they're there, but that I love that the point that Tim drew out, and if you want to clarify on this, but this is what I understand to be true as well, is that the 613 that law code that we have represented even in the Torah is not the full representation of what it all was. It was what was selected out and put into that as this narrative historical account that was later given to generations that are well beyond the days of Moses, when you have all the final editors and arrangers, bringing these things together. And that's important to understand as we approach to get the truth out of it. It's like, it's the same thing. It's the same question that we wrestle with no matter what subject I'm talking about with another scholar, is like, if we don't foundationally address what the Bible is, like if we don't start there, we can really get off into gray areas of all this other discourse of things that really, that's like, right. That it's like you said with our understanding of the Torah and, Jesus' relationship to it. We get that wrong. I use this analogy all the time. It's a golf swing. If I swing just a little bit off to the left at the beginning, it's going to go so far away, where if I can make that slight course correction, it really makes a big difference. So next, I want to move on to our understanding of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, not just as narrative, which we both agreed there's a meta-narrative that's woven through it. However, differences we may find, we both agree there. But next, I want to see it as wisdom literature. So let's watch this next shorter clip and then discuss.
Well, we need to remember all biblical literature is ancient literature. This is part of our paradigm.
Yeah, this is ancient literature.
It's ancient literature, and it's wisdom for all later generations of God's people. So we are not the first audience of these commands. The audience of these commands are ancient Israelites, escaped slaves who were having their identity reformed in the transition between the Bronze and Iron Age, in the ancient Near East.
And these laws are dialed into that context. And so to simply copy and paste without doing your cultural background homework is likely lead in the long term, or even in the short term, to, I think, misapplication, misuse of these laws. So it's wisdom literature. There's divine wisdom for all of God's people of any place and any time, but we will hear that wisdom by learning to read these in context, literary context and ancient context. And you can see Jesus doing that, and you can see the Apostle Paul doing that by how they draw upon and quote from this section.
You're talking about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, especially doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
And Paul, when he did it kind of famously with don't muzzle the ox.
Yeah, he did it by quoting from a law in Deuteronomy about how to treat your animal.
Yeah.
And he takes that as a wisdom reflection on how to compensate leaders in a local house church.
Yeah.
Which then Christians throughout history have taken as wisdom for how to compensate clergy
Yeah.
in other church structures. So we're all using the Bible as wisdom literature. The point is to become hyper aware of it.
The point is to become hyper aware of it. So before I say another word, Paul, respond to that video and how the law of Moses can be considered wisdom literature.
I mean, obviously, absolutely right. Context just conditions the interpretation, and there's no such thing as an interpretation that isn't conditioned by a context. The question is, are you going to import your own context, or try to find one that arises from the text itself, and from the culture that produced it? And so I think absolutely, yeah, it's that point about context is necessary. And there's multiple contexts that are relevant depending on what you're studying. So of course there's the Torah on its own, but then once you're talking about, say, Jesus's interpretation of it, you're not really just talking about the Torah on its own. We know that the Torah had been interpreted for hundreds of years, so that by the time of Jesus's reading, or interpretation rather, he's a member of a culture that already has accepted norms of interpretation of a given commandment, right? So that, when you're reading Jesus's interpretation of a given commandment, you're not just suddenly reading this singular moment who's suddenly out of nowhere rising above his culture and sort of somehow zapping back to the original one and then finding this and applying, right? Like he's a member of a culture who has inherited generations of interpretations, such that what might not seem straightforward from us in the Torah itself is all of a sudden just an assumed interpretation by the time of his, but by his time, and that may well be that Jesus just agrees with that interpretation as well. And so so when I'm talking about Jesus and the law, I'm not simply talking about sort of as if I have Jesus sort of like he's got the Torah open in one lap, and on his other lap he's got sort of a commentary by Jacob Milgram, and he's like, okay, but in really the ancient Near Eastern context it was this. It's as if he's like, no, I mean he's reading the Torah within the conversation, the intramural conversation that was already ongoing in what I called late Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of his period. Now, in terms of the wisdom literature, yes, I mean I do think the Bible generally can be described this way as well. And the one way I would not want to say that, I'm not saying this as if the Bible Project has said this. I'm just saying this on my own in case people misunderstand me. Sometimes people will pit sort of wisdom literature sort of over against I'm going to use this word, casuistry. And casuistry is almost always a negative term. It's casuistry is the practice of reading a commandment, very, very particular in its context and applying it to certain cases. And so saying that, okay, the commandment has these various conditions in it, and all those conditions need to be met in order for this commandment to be sort of applicable or performed or whatever. Sort of just, in other words, recognizing the case that is before you and all the conditions that contribute to it. So I think some people might say that, okay, well, doing that's casuistry, sort of being very specific about all the conditions and reading it very closely, and then applying it maybe even literally, and that's something other than wisdom literature, which is just sort of like kind of vibing with the flow of the or the sort of the inner logic. And I want to say, I think you can do both. You can have a person who is reading a text very closely, scrupulously, seeing its conditions and recognizing sort of the legal, aspect that's at stake, and then using God-given wisdom and your own comparison with other ethical norms that you see the scriptures requiring, and coming to a conclusion as to how one ought to keep that particular commandment. So I would want to say that yes, it's wisdom literature, but that wouldn't necessarily be disjunctive with, right, close readings of particular laws, and also thinking that okay, these laws ought to be performed because God gave us these laws, right? And so again, I don't say that as if Bible Project has said something other than that. I would just want to make sure that I'm not hurt to be decoupling those kinds of an approach to the Torah itself.
You're saying it's not a either or, it's a both and, when we can look at it from that side of it. And what I hear you saying, and I think the Bible Project is saying the same thing, you guys are saying at the same time, it takes work.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
The literature is not designed as if some law code that you come to it, you read it like, oh, I got XYZ problem, here's XYZ answer, plug it in, let's roll.
Sure.
That's the point of it being wisdom literature, is it doesn't give up its treasure on the first cursory reading.
Yes.
That actually this is a text of a lifetime that is leading you into this love of God and love of neighbor, as we'll get into later, but that it's leading you to this full lifestyle of being human, and that takes work and effort with the text and within ourselves, that it's not going to give up those treasures on the first end. You've got to meditate on it. That's why we call it meditation literature as well. Yeah. So I don't want to cut you off.
That's why sorry. And Tim has that phrase. He says sort of like, it's like cup of tea literature, right? It's like read it, have your tea, read it again, walk around, think about it, right? It's as you said, it's not going to yield its treasure. And that's where I think it's really important to not, and again, not that they've done that, but to not decouple those, because, right, the reflection is only valuable to the degree that you're actually reflecting on what it really says, and to think with it, right? Yes. And so that can, like, sort of that reflection component is best combined with very close attention to detail and reading, and so I think that's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I love that, man. See, we landed there together, and I think I'm gonna I may not play the clip, but let me ask this question, because I think it's really important. Because a lot of us, when we think of the law, like we just talked about, we think of this set code. It was said this way. This is the way it's going to be, and really, the Bible doesn't present the Torah or the law like that. So, you have this wonderful quote. I want to read it. The depiction, therefore, of Israel living under the law is not that of a people bearing an intolerable burden by which they struggle to earn their salvation, or a burden causing despair of ever finding a gracious God. On the contrary, the law assured them of God's desire to dwell with them and declare to them the divinely prescribed means through which they could regularly commune with God and experience his forgiveness and grace. And the point here is that this just isn't a one moment in time that this was designed for, that this was designed for future generations as well. So, Paul, when many of us hear that word law, we instinctively think of something like a burden or a written code that can never be changed. So tell me, without even going into this last clip, because I read a lot about this in your book, so I know you have something to say about this. Can the law change? Like, is the law this set in stone code, or how does it adapt to culture and context even throughout the story of Scripture?
By the time you get to sort of the Jesus's interpretation in the context in which he is interpreting Torah, I think he would probably say that the Torah as we received it is stable and is itself not quite subject to change. I think the way I'd still nuance that, though, in the way that you might be getting at, is we see that the Torah itself has to change for subsequent social conditions, right? So, for example, you've got in Numbers 5, right, the people in certain states of ritual impurity, if they have lepra, or if they all the various bases upon which they might be rendered impure, they're then told to be removed from the camp. So now that's the law, right? Except, right, they got that law while they're in the wilderness in a camp setting. So now all of a sudden they are flash forward 100 years or whatever, and they're settled in the land. They're settled in the land, and they're not in a wilderness camp setting. And um, and what would it mean to apply this law? And so they don't want to change the wording of it. They want to see that, okay, there was something here that we ought to maintain, and yet they recognize that, well, we're not all on a football field together now, right? Or however big the surface area was, right? Like we're not all within this quarter mile range, and together, like we're now living hundreds of miles away from each other, and there's this so how do we apply this? And they eventually came up with a somewhat stable interpretation, which was that they identified the camp of Numbers 5, from which the people ought to be removed, with Jerusalem and or the temple itself. Typically Jerusalem, if I'm remembering correctly. Now the point is that they recognized at that point, subsequent generations later, that they couldn't just like look at their solution. Their solution wasn't saying, okay, well, we're not in the camp anymore, so let's take Numbers 5 out of our Bible, right? Their solution was, okay, well, this situation doesn't apply anymore. It can't in other words, it can't correspond one-to-one with our current situation. So now we have to interpret what the camp is. And so then they this is where I think, again, the wisdom literature aspect, they think with the logic of it, they reflect on it, and they think, okay, well, what made the camp, right? It was the fact that God was there in the midst of us with the tabernacle, and we were camped around it. That was why impurity was dangerous there, because you could have impurity proximate to the divine presence. So thinking with that, where is God now? Or in the sense of like, where is his abode? Well, it's in Jerusalem. So let's make the camp law, let's not change its wording, but let's apply it to this particular situation. So there's that. There's also in the sense that its interpretation can become so like there are certain laws that they just recognize at a certain point that, okay, this, whatever it meant then, we don't whether they knew what it meant then or not, they recognize that they're in a situation in which, to quote Sanders, this particular law will just be unlivable. So how do we adopt to it? And how do we make it work, as it were? And if, again, here I'm quoting Sanders, or paraphrasing Sanders' point about this, is he said that this was one of the things that the Pharisees did, is that, there's this law in Leviticus that says, right, like, if a carcass falls into your drink, it's impure. But then all of a sudden, like, and that's all it says, right? But then, like, or carcass of a swarming thing. But then all of a sudden, like, a gnat would constitute that or something, right? Like, it's all of a sudden now we've got this problem with gnats in our drink, and if this law applies to that, then all of a sudden all our stuff would be impure, and we would never. And so they ruled, again, paraphrasing Sanders here, if I'm remembering correctly, that they ruled that the carcass had to be effectively the size of a lentil. So basically a fly, like it had to be a large fly, for this to really count. A gnat, that doesn't count, right? Even though that actually kind of goes against what's written, because the written letter just says carcass of a swarming thing, right? And yet they were like, but look, come on. And so they strained out gnats, and we're fine with that. So that's a good example of, like, okay, adapting to a new situation, either because they just thought that's what it really meant in the first place, or they recognized that what it meant was not really quite, livable. And so they made that change.
Yeah, I see that. There's to me, and what I get from reading your book, The Bible Project, and following Jesus, is that there's an underlying logic of the Torah that is built in for the shortcomings of how the Torah approaches culture and context. And whenever one of those things come up, there's an underlying wisdom. And the clip that I had shared was the daughters of Zelophehad, I believe, in Joshua 19. And what happens is these daughters come up, and they can't come into the land. They can't because their father didn't have a son. They can't get land.
Yep.
And they go to Joshua, and they're like, "Hey, this isn't right. We should be able to have land." And Joshua takes it to Yahweh, and they literally make we watch law like change,
an amendment,
and an amendment happen in real time, because, and this is what I love too, and we're going to get into this because I think this is important. The underlying logic and wisdom of the Torah is always looking for the outcasts and those who are normally shunned and put to the outskirts, right? So, like, even that one with Zelophehad, like, these women, they're destitute, they're on the outskirts. Like, hey, the underlying logic and wisdom of the Torah is that we should be looking out for people like this. So if the Torah is ever putting someone out, then we need to look at this. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it does to me, and I think it's important that we understand the law as wisdom literature, and that it's not just this written code. Even though like you said, it's a both and. It is a written code. There are do not murder, honor your father and mother. There are things that are written that way, but it's I think if we're honest, it's more the other way that we view it than that way. So bringing that balance is what we're here for.
Yeah.
So let's get to restoration eschatology, because I really love this part of your book, mainly also because it brought us into the Lord's Prayer. It's near and dear to my heart. It's a big focus for this channel. It's something that I'm engaged with every single day of my life, and I love that you opened up chapter 2 by saying, I prayed the Lord's Prayer for years without pausing to ask what it would mean for God's name to be sanctified. God's kingdom arriving was plain enough, and I think I understood well enough to plea for forgiveness, but it wasn't until my first year of Greek that I heard the translation, deliver us from the evil one. Rather than a general request to avoid bad things happening to me, with these few words, Jesus teaches his disciples to pray that God sanctify his own name, that he bring his kingdom, that he release Israel from indebtedness, and that he rescue his people from captivity to Satan. So these translations do not simply render Greek words more plainly, they also imply a situation that requires some explanation. So Paul, I love that you brought this point out, with a focus on our enemy even. And I would love for you to pause here and help us understand what situation the Lord's Prayer opens our eyes to see that we currently inhabit.
Yeah, really good question, and a beating heart of the book. I suppose there's only one beating heart, so whatever. It's an internal organ that's quite vital. So I've used this analogy a few times now, so forgive me, but it's just such an apt analogy, and I think it's helpful. I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, 2-year-old. Play with a lot of Play-Doh, and I was playing with them one day, and they have those little Play-Doh cookie cutter shapes, right? Whatever they are, star, heart, square, whatever. And of course, once you select that shape, it doesn't matter how much Play-Doh you put through it. Doesn't matter what color the Play-Doh is, mish and mash it all together, whatever. If that's the shape you've selected, whatever it is, the star shape, and then you crank that Play-Doh through it, right, on a Play-Doh hand crank, that Play-Doh's coming through that little putty shape, the same shape every time, no matter what. Applying this to the Gospels, if you've got sort of a particular framework that you assume is the cookie cutter shape, by which you interpret all the gospel passages, the Play-Doh, then it doesn't matter what gospel passage you feed through that framework. It's all going to come out looking like, well, whatever the framework you've already decided is, right? So if you already think the issue is, right, the Pharisees are legalistic or whatever, well, then any controversy between them is going to be, when you crank the evidence out, you're like, oh, okay, well, I know what this is about. The Pharisees are legalistic and Jesus isn't. Jesus is the opposite of that, right? So then you're going to interpret the data along that axis. Same deal with other isms that I talk about in the book. Now, my point is to say is that doing that puts the framework of interpretation largely in terms of a pattern of religion. Look, the Pharisees are doing Judaism this way, legalistically, but Jesus is wanting them to do Judaism this way, sort of graciously and Christianly, right? That sort of idea. So then you basically have Jesus and the Pharisees going toe-to-toe about the best way to do their own religion, right? Which then collapses, which first of all, I think is just incorrect, but also then then collapses all the controversy narratives, causing you to miss what is actually, in my view, at stake. This brings me to the probably closer answer to your question, is that the framework that I think is operative, that helps explain lots of different of the law controversies between his contemporaries, and also helps explain sort of positively what he's teaching about and heralding and all that sort of stuff, is this framework that you mentioned, restoration eschatology. And in restoration eschatology, it's this pattern of reading, particularly the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy 28-30 and Leviticus 26, a pattern of reading of those particular texts that I just named, in which they are seen to tell a story the story particularly of Israel receiving the law, Israel violating the law, and then consequently Israel receiving all the promised punitive discipline that would befall them for their breach of the covenant, namely exile, subjugation, and everything else. And that, as Deuteronomy 30 says, that it's from that state of exile and subjugation that they would then return to God with all their heart, and God would restore them. So, in other words, Deuteronomy 28 to 30 tells a story of Israel's covenant breach, discipline, and subsequent restoration.
Mm.
And the restoration is not just a restoration of all the things they've lost. That's really good on its own, right? The restoration of going from Babylon back to Judea, re-inheriting the land, throwing the yoke of your enemies off your shoulder, that sort of thing. But also, in particular, a restoration of the heart. So it's where God says, I'll circumcise your heart. I'll transform your heart. And of course, this metaphor gets picked up in the prophets as well, Ezekiel 36 and Jeremiah 31. And it's this notion that it won't just be sort of a change of circumstance, it will also be an anthropological, a human interior change with a purpose, so that the people will, follow God with all their heart, love the Lord their God with all their heart, and keep his ways. Now, my point is that I try to show in the book that in the Judaism of the day, sort of late Second Temple Judaism, it was a very common reading of those texts of Deuteronomy 28 and 30 and Leviticus 26 and the prophetic material as well. It was a very common reading of those texts to do just that, to say, okay, we Israel received the law, we Israel broke the law, we Israel are consequently were faced with the discipline, the exile, and everything else. And this is the point, we're still in it. And so very clearly, not every text says this, right? Not every, I'm not saying this sort of every Jew would have thought this or said this, right? But it's available, widely available in lots of Jewish evidence of the period, that they recognize that, yes, that's our story, our past, and it's kind of controlling our present right now, such that because we're still in that punitive discipline, exile, subjugation to the nations, whatever, we are still in that, and yet we know that restoration is on the horizon. And because we know restoration is on the horizon, we need to get ready for it, wait for it, look for it, prepare ourselves for it, and we need to, of course, also we need to return to God, because God said that in the exile we ought to return to him. So let's all return to God. Come on. And then I'm saying that particular framework, restoration eschatology, is I think the most appropriate framework that you then by which you interpret the gospel data best, namely that the gospels are depicting Jesus as both the herald of this restoration and its executor. He's the one executed, bringing to bear the fruit of this restoration in his own work and ministry, and of course through the commissioning of his disciples.
No,
so that's the restoration eschatology. Which now that means then, that so then look at all the plights then, scattered in exile, even those who are in the land, they still recognize that some of our tribes are out there still scattered, and then even for those who are in the land, we're captive, Roman forces occupy us, and before that, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, all that sort of stuff. But also importantly, the idea is that okay, it's not just the nations that rule over us, it's the powers that rule those nations. If we're subject to Rome, it means we're probably subject to the powers that rule Rome, That's what's bad about it, Same deal with Egypt, Whenever Israel is rescued from Egypt, it wasn't just sort of God thumping Pharaoh on the nose, He says, when I did all of that, when I rescued you guys, I passed judgment on the gods of Egypt,
Yeah.
So when you're being rescued from a captive, you're also consequently being rescued from the power that rules those captors. Now, all that, so they're scattered, they're subjugated, but also importantly, some texts describe Israel's sin as sort of a debt that they racked up, such that in the restoration it would be when God's releasing them from their debt, You see this I walk through a handful of those texts in the book. I think Isaiah 61 sort of speaks to this. Some Qumran texts speak to that, where they describe sin as a debt, and so consequently the restoration as a release from those debts. And of course, famously, Matthew. That's the thing. So all of a sudden, if those are the plights, well, then what you would need is what you would need is to God to gather you, to rescue you from your enemies, and to release you from those debts. Which is, I then kind of make that work or show how I think that works, rather, in this particular what we call the Lord's Prayer. Lord, sanctify your name. Right? That's an odd phrase. It's not self-evident what that means, except when you, to use again Bible Project language, I mean, when you got the hyperlink to God sanctifying his own name, it takes you back to Ezekiel 36, where God said, okay, you guys are scattered everywhere, and in exile, my name's being profaned. But one day, particularly in the Septuagint, it says this, the Greek translation is, I will sanctify my name. And the product of God sanctifying his name is rescuing Israel from exile and captivity, right? So Jesus opens his prayer as, God, do what you said you do. You said you'd sanctify your name when you rescue us from captivity and exile and all that sort of stuff. So God, sanctify your name. In other words, rescue us from all this stuff. Rescue us from the evil one, right? Because if we're captive to the nations and the powers that rule them, well, then we need to be rescued from them.
Yeah.
Release us from our debts, just as we release those who are indebted against us. And importantly, the one I love the most, well, they're all awesome. How can you not love them all? But give us today our bread for tomorrow. That's how I translate that particular. It's often translated, right? Give us today our daily bread. But I think he's saying, give us today our bread for tomorrow, because he's tapping into restoration as this sort of national Sabbath, right? Where God brings them their rest again, right? Brings rest to them. And so in the Sabbath legislation, both in the Sabbath, but also in the Jubilee legislation, which is a kind of big national type Sabbath festival, they are not to work on the seventh day, and they are to prepare their food on the sixth day so that they'll have it on the seventh, right? So you see that in the wilderness generation, right? When they're out there and they're getting fed by the manna, and God says through Moses, right? Hey, don't go out on the seventh day to gather, right? God's gonna give you a double portion on the sixth day, so that you have enough food for the next day. And that's Jesus's prayer, right? Like, give us today the bread we'll need for tomorrow.
Yeah.
In other words, restoration's on the horizon. It's here. Like he's praying that God deliver on all these promises. Give us today the bread that we need for tomorrow, because your restoration is the thing we're wanting. So.
No, I love that. And so much was flooding through my mind as you were talking. You know, one of the big things is just realizing that there was this hyper awareness and focus and leaning and yearning for a Messiah during the time of Jesus. N.T. Wright has a really great book where he brings up all the different Messiahs that were around in Jesus' time. It's like there was a lot of Messiahs before, during, and after Jesus. And there was this eager expectation that all of this was bringing, and it was the suffering of God's people throughout their own stupidity, just like mine, but at the hands of the nations that ruled them. And yeah, man, this why I think restoration, eschatology, and all this is so important. And you just mentioned it briefly, but I want to go there because I think Jubilee is very, very, very important. And you brought that out in the book, and it was a moment for me. So sticking with the theme of the Lord's Prayer in chapter 2, you have a section titled Forgive Us Our Debts, and this is where the Jubilee comes in. So in this chapter, you describe how God legislates a Jubilee every 50th year, and you say some restoration texts employ Jubilee terminology and logic to describe God's act of restoration in which Israel will return to its ancestral land and be released from captivity to foreign nations. So, Paul, help us understand how Jesus' restoration announcement is actually coded as an eschatological jubilee.
Great. Awesome question. And yes, again, another vital internal organ to the book because it explains not only, or as I think it fleshes out rather, doesn't explain it, it kind of fleshes out, I think, what Jesus is announcing, but also informs some of his nomistic law-ish act. I think particularly the healing episode where he heals the woman on the Sabbath, the woman bent over double. So let's start with the Jubilee itself. The Jubilee is legislated in Leviticus 25. It is, it's, and in that particular time, they are not to do agricultural labor. So don't sow or till or reap and all that sort of stuff. Also, if land had become so impoverished that perhaps you leased land off to sell some debt or something like that, for whatever reason you've leased off some land, in the Jubilee that land goes back to its original owner. So people go back to their original land. If you were an Israelite and you were so impoverished that you sold yourself into sort of debt slavery, sort of pay off a debt and to do so by your servitude, Well, then when the Jubilee struck, that was it. You were released. You were out. You were free. And that was whether you were, and importantly, actually, that was whether you were a captive to an Israelite or even a non-Israelite who lived in the land, right? And then, so we'll pause there. I think that's sufficient. So all of a sudden you've got, look, you go back to your land, you are released from non-Israelite captors. Those are two important motifs in Jubilee legislation. Now, importantly, for those who are either have paid close attention to what we already said or already are familiar with, Hebrew Bible and restoration and eschatology, those particular plights are typologically identical to what Israel is facing in their punitive discipline. They are outside of their ancestral land, and they are captive to non-Israelites. And so what they need is, of course, restoration, but then you can see how it would make sense to code the restoration as a Jubilee because, hey, you're going back to your ancestral land and you're being released from your non-Israelite captor.
Yeah.
So I think that Isaiah 61, other scholars have noted, this is not unique to me, that Isaiah 61 plays on that notion, that this herald, the one anointed by the Spirit to do all these things, is also announcing the year of release, the release of our debts and opening the prisons and letting out the captives. And so this notion that this figure will do restoration stuff, but that at least that one particular verse codes the restoration as Jubilee. I have a longer argument in the book as to how it also gets picked up in, I think, this text from Qumran, 11Q Melchizedek, and possibly Daniel 9. The point for our purposes is that's, I think, sufficiently, maybe, I think that probably makes enough sense for now. The idea is that what the Jubilee legislates, the plights rather that it meets are typologically identical to the plights that Israel is facing, and so it would make sense for Jubilee motifs to be used when talking about the restoration. So then the Gospels, I think, do just that. They depict Jesus as the one who's not just sort of announcing restoration like, hey, good news. It's that, but it's particularly got this Jubilee inflection, and I think that comes out with his announcements of debt release, where sins are metaphorized as debts, and so we're being released from our debts, but it also means like our transgressions are being forgiven. But also liberation from captors. So he's going around, he's exorcising people, or he's quite literally liberating them from their foreign captor, right? And of course he teaches, I think in Matthew 5, I think he's teaching when he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land." Is he's talking about this land inheritance thing again. So I think these Jubilee, I think aspects of the restoration are appropriately sort of inflected or coded with Jubilee terminology, and that comes out in pretty vital moments in Jesus's teaching and stuff. So that when it also then kind of gives a context for precisely all those things, like his exorcisms and his healings, which sort of in one of his healings he describes his healing as an act of liberation. So anyway, I'll pause there. I feel like that was
great. You gave me a lot there to like, even, I've read the book and heard the things, and that was some new things there. But what's rolling through my head right now is the irony of these people that not following their own Jubilee causes them to need a Jubilee. Because this is actually gonna tie in perfectly with something we'll talk about towards the end. Is that you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but that so with that Jubilee, God gave a promise that if you follow this, you'll have no poor people in the land. Am I correct? That was what he said. Like, if you follow this forgiveness, I go back and look at it, but I'm almost certain that he said if you follow this prescription, where every 50th year you forgive debts, you forgive the land ownership, you set the captives free, you will have no poverty among you. You'll have no poor people among you. And
that's certainly, it's certainly the aspiration, and it's there both in Deuteronomy 15, which is the debt remission text, and Jubilee, with the notion that, look, this 50th year thing will keep sort of debt poverty from being generational, right? You get a reset button right there.
Yeah. And it's their lack of following that Jubilee that puts them into their need of this ultimate Jubilee that comes through, because obviously they never fully followed it. I mean, that's what I see. So yeah, thank you so much. I think there's so much there. I can't wait to go back and listen to that and unpack more. So that was really great. Thank you. So now I want to move on to something that we're going to tap back into the narrative because it's important because we're talking about the nations, right?
Okay.
I love how throughout your book the importance of God's people against the nations is highlighted because it's all over the text. You say after the resurrection, Jesus has become victorious over the nations and the powers that rule them, and that the commission to go out to all the nations is connected logically to Jesus's possession of complete authority in heaven and on earth. Get this, due to the assumed cosmology that the other nations were temporarily ruled by other powers. So I want to get into this assumed cosmology. I've prepared one last short clip going over this sentiment for us to discuss, as I think it's pivotal to understand the narrative and the Torah. So let's watch this clip together and then discuss. How's that sound?
Great.
Let's do it.
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
So let's start in the beginning. In Genesis 1, God creates a beautiful, ordered reality out of darkness and disorder so that life can flourish. He appoints humans as his representatives to rule over all of it. But in Genesis 3, we meet a creature who's in a state of rebellion against his creator. We're not told yet why or how he rebels, but he's on a mission to ruin God's good world for other creatures. This creature is the Bible's first portrait of evil. It distorts what God has purposed for good, ruining and dragging creation back into darkness and disorder.
So the humans join the spiritual rebel, which leads them back into chaos and death.
And from this point on, the human rebellion is interwoven with a spiritual rebellion. He says they could rule the world like God, but by their own wisdom.
So they're all kicked out of the garden.
Yeah, God says this rebel will now crawl on its belly.
Where does it go after this?
After the snake comes the rebellion of the sons of God in Genesis 6. We're told that they have sex with women who then give birth to violent warrior giants.
Oh, right, the Nephilim.
The ancient kingdoms around Israel claimed to be founded and protected by giant warrior kings who were part human, part God, and filled with divine wisdom.
Yeah, and one of those kings in Genesis 10 goes on to build the city of Babylon.
Yes, Nimrod, whose name sounds like the Hebrew word for rebel. And his kingdom leads to the next rebellion, where humans exalt themselves in Babylon.
But God scatters that rebellion.
And when Moses in Deuteronomy looks back at that story, he says that's the moment when God handed over the nations to worship the rebel host of heaven, the gods of money, sex, and military power. Moses is the first one to call them demons, that is, lesser spiritual beings.
So demons are spiritual forces at work behind corrupt human power structures.
Bible Project comes through again, condenses a year's worth of material into 1 minute, and I'm so grateful for them. So, Paul, this supernatural Hebrew aspect of the narrative is normally all but forgotten or feared to be covered by most scholars. So I'm glad that you included this concept and that assumed cosmology that you spoke about. So respond to that clip. Tell us what your thoughts are on that, and why you think there's a tendency in academia to avoid this aspect.
Great question, Jason. So yeah, I'm with them on this. I mean, again, there's always sort of little X's and O's one might say differently, but no, I think it is it's sort of baked in to the Torah. It's implicit and explicit often throughout the scriptures, both in Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. The notion that the other nations are being governed, is the way I put it, being governed by subordinate created spiritual beings. The text happily calls them gods on occasion, but I'll also call them, as Moses did, demons there in Deuteronomy 32, verse, I think, 17 or 18. And of course, the Psalm, we'll put it that way, Psalm, I think it's 96:5 or 95:5, I can't remember the Septuagintal numbering, but where they are, they say the gods of the nations are images, but then the Septuagintal translations of the gods of the nations are demons. And so I think it's the reason why I include it is not simply because, okay, it's an interesting fact that here, I'll just throw it in there, right? I think it helps explain aspects of, again, Jesus's own ministry, where he's right out of the gates, right after his baptism, he's confronted with, right, the Satan figure, right? And he says, look, shows him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and says, I can give this you want because it's all the kingdom and their authority have been given to me, and I'll give them to you. Just worship me, right? And so he offers Jesus this authority over over heaven and earth, right? Or at least all the kingdoms of the earth, rather. And of course, Jesus resists. Also, I'll note he resists by obeying the Torah. He resists, and each quotation is a quotation of, I think, Deuteronomy 8, more or less. But also importantly, he resists that, and yet then at the end of it, the end of the Gospels, that is, particularly pronounced in Matthew, is that the text you quoted a moment ago, Matthew 28, 18 through 20, where he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been handed to me. He now possesses all authority in heaven and earth, and it seems to function as the logical basis for the apostles being commissioned to the nations. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, etc. So, if you have to have some sort of, there's a logical basis for them in Jesus' own instruction. There's clearly a supernatural world out there in the Gospels. He's like, he's talking with Satan in the wilderness, and he's exorcising people from unclean spirits and other things. The woman that he heals in Luke 13 is bound by Satan, right? The reason I think it's relevant is because it both characterizes the plight that Israel's facing. It helps you see that, okay, yes, their subjection to Rome is bad for lots of reasons, but it's also partially bad because it means that they're subject to the powers that rule over Rome, and that this is why you need God to come exercise his reign, because it's precisely the fact that his reign is coming to supplant the rule of other powers who are in charge right now, and they're not good. They're and so it helps explain positively the fact that the words of his adult ministry, the first words rather of his adult ministry in Mark, are repent therefore because God's reign is near. So it helps you think about God's kingdom in that way. It's not just this abstract comment. It's the fact that he's coming to reign, which is the content of the gospel in Isaiah 52, right? Like, go proclaim this good news. Behold, here is your God. So it's the good news, the news that's good is this announcement that God is coming back to reign, and he's supplanting a reign of other powers. So that's one. Two, it then helps explain positively, or I should say it helps contextualize positively a lot of his interactions with Satan, unclean spirits, and all that sort of stuff, so that you see the restoration as, okay, if the restoration is God's reign, and if he's commissioned the Messiah to be the one who's implementing that, it means that his work of battling Satan, unclean spirits, whatever, is sort of it's implementing God's reign in these people's lives in particular ways, not just some sort of abstract spiritual sense, but real. They're healed, right? Thirdly, I think it helps explain, again, the text you already quoted, Matthew 28, where he now possesses all authority in heaven and earth. And what I think, the reason I think that cosmology is helpful here is because it means that the authority that these other spiritual powers had is now subordinated to the Messiah itself. So the Messiah is, right, the one who possesses all authority in heaven, and so consequently on earth, right, because the spiritual powers rule things in the nation. So if he's got all the heavenly authority, well, then consequently he now has all authority over the nations. So therefore, apostles go talk to him.
And that's why they got in so much trouble and beheaded and martyred when they brought this message.
And so I just sorry, I was taking a sip. So yeah, I just think it's it's not a. Some people, I think, will bring it up because I shouldn't judge the motives of other people. I know some people like to talk about it just because they like to talk about weird stuff, right? They're like, oh, this is esoteric and weird. Let's talk about it. I'm like, okay, sure, that's interesting. I bring it to bear in the gospel material because I think it's relevant to how lots of passages work, and it helps contextualize both the identity of Jesus and his role, but also the basis for sending out the nations now, right? The apostles to the nations. But also, you asked the question of why are people reluctant to do it? Again, I don't want to guess on motives. I don't know. There could be some. I said I don't want to do it, and then began to do it. There could be some who just it could just cause discomfort, or they're just used. It's easier in a lot of ways, easier in scare quotes to be able to describe Jesus with our own sort of categories that we're familiar with, which are largely instinctively naturalistic, and so would screen this aspect of the story out. And so, yeah, I shouldn't say beyond that. I don't know, because I don't
No,
want
I
to
get that. I appreciate that. And you did answer, and I think that it's important to just understand that this is something that isn't just brought out to be weird. That it's an integral part of the narrative. That Jesus, this restoration eschatology that we just talked about, it's a necessary theme for us to understand within that. I mean, you even carry it forward to Pentecost, when the disciples and Peter are speaking in all these different languages. It's like this declaration to the nations of Jesus's ultimate rule and authority. And when we couple that into a story that's just about my sin management and going to heaven, it loses its frame to where, if we understand what we just watched in that short Bible Project clip, that no, there was a lot going on in the narrative, and we are sinful and guilty and following. It's like this. I love the way that they say it. That from that point on, the spiritual rebellion, or the human rebellion, was interwoven with the spiritual rebellion. It doesn't absolve us. If anything, it convicts us, but it convicts us within the right framework of the story. So I'm grateful for you, and I want to applaud you for including that in your book. And I might just be off balance even asking it, but like, as I was reasoning with the logic of your book, which I loved, this kind of came to my mind a couple times, like the pivotal Gentile characters inside the Jewish narrative. We have characters like Melchizedek, we have Rahab, Ruth, Naaman, Cyrus the Great, and others are biblical examples of these humans that were intimately connected with God, not all of them that I just listed, but some, with Yahweh outside as a Gentile. How do we account for these individuals within the narrative? Do they hold significance, and am I bringing them up for no reason, or does that make sense to you?
No, I'm sure you're bringing them up for a reason. As it relates to my particular book and the Torah, one of the points I was trying to say was, look, Torah is the commandments that make up their covenantal agreement, and it's the way, keeping them is the way in which they express their allegiance to the Lord. And I was trying to say that in a context over against a context that some people might assume, in which they think, oh, Torah is this impossible burden. And I'm trying to speak to that particular reading. Like, no, actually, I don't think the Torah itself presents it as a sort of impossible burden that was just sort of like, I can't believe we have to do this again today. Rather, it was it's the way they express their allegiance to the Lord bodily and interiorly, very importantly. So that then, I don't mean to say that sort of, therefore the nations were just had no way to express their their either obedience or desire to follow him or something like that. It was more speaking to that particular question. So in these particular cases, these examples are examples of figures who are brought in somehow or another by virtue of either their treatment of an Israelite or their recognition of the Lord's power, Yahweh's power, right? And I that's how I envision them. What then becomes of them? Are they absorbed into Israel and so subsequently do all that is required of Israel vis-a-vis the Torah, or do they maintain? Are they members of? They stay in the land as sort of resident aliens, or what? Is a slightly different question, but that's how I'd begin to answer that question.
No, that makes sense, and it's showing that they have a place in the story, even if per se the narrative isn't highlighting their Torah observance, that these outside nations. I mean, it's what I always think about. I'm doing a lot of projects right now with Native American Indians. I've got some great friends that are Christians that live on the Navajo reservation, and I always just get so bugged and disturbed by how all of our history is focused on this one small map of the world over in modern Europe and what happened in Jerusalem, and then we're just like, man, God wasn't doing anything over here in the Americas, no, he's the God of the world, and there are Melchizedeks all over the place that maybe we don't even know about. So I think that's good. So as we're rounding third, I really want to get to this point because it's important, and it's why I was praising God with a hallelujah for your book. Is the focus of love of neighbor. And I think that this is where we're going to get to that underlying logic and wisdom of the Torah that matters. So both Jesus and the Apostle Paul echo the Hebrew scriptures when they sum up the entire Torah with the adage of loving your neighbor as yourself, obviously coupled with loving God with all your heart. But inside chapter 3, you say that Jesus specifically chose the commands from the Torah in Matthew 5, when he said, "You've heard it said," because they signified that love of neighbor was of the utmost importance. You say it makes sense then Jesus' interpretation of love your neighbor would conclude this body of teaching about commandments explicitly related to neighbor treatment. Loving one's neighbor does not permit hatred of one's enemy. Rather, loving one's neighbor, as Leviticus 19:18 implies, requires loving one's enemies, pursuing reconciliation with opponents, and treating them in a way that precludes or stems conflict in the first place. Thus, Jesus' command, "Love your enemies," both concludes and summarizes his body of teaching that instructs his followers how they ought to treat neighbors. So famously, I'm going to follow me here because that we've got that part, right? Famously, Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" We all know the story of the Jewish man robbed, beaten, and left for dead. And in that story, the Samaritan is brought out to be the neighbor, the one who stops to help the person. And Jesus specifies that a neighbor is one who helps another human need regardless of their national or religious affiliation. I wonder if you could speak to this parable of the Good Samaritan and the underlying logic of the Torah of loving our neighbor.
Great. Yeah. So I'll start with the first one first. Or sorry,
that was big.
The second one you said I'll start first. Yeah. So my point there in particular in Matthew 5 is that he's got all these things, right? He says, you've heard it said, "Don't commit adultery," but I say da da da. Or you've heard it said, whatever, "No false vows," but I say da da da. And people have wondered at the organizational principle here, like, what is it? Like, why did he pick these? Like, because it can't just be that he picked things that were notoriously difficult to interpret, because everything in the Torah was subject to lots of interpretation. So there was lots of stuff. And so I also was curious, because at one level you could think, it doesn't matter, but I just was to satisfy curiosity. And so I went back to the original legislation, and every single quoted commandment is either within the commandment or contiguous with it, like the next commandment is, look, don't do that one thing, whatever it was, because you thereby be mistreating your neighbor, right? Yeah. But I thought, surely this isn't coincidental that every single one of the commandments he quotes and then interprets is related to neighbor treatment, which then makes sense with the fact that he closes with it, right? That's why the line you read, like, it both closes and summarizes his whole point. And importantly, one of the things I'm trying to say there is that look, people will hear "love your neighbor as yourself," and of course, one of the mistakes they'll make is they'll think, "Oh, right, Jesus innovated that," right? Whereas really, of course, obviously, it's just the Torah itself, just Leviticus 19. But then also they'll think that, okay, but love your enemy, that was standard, hate your enemy, that was standard in Jewish interpretation, and that's the law would lead you that direction or something like that. And I think, actually, no. If you're reading through Leviticus 19, a lot of it is about, and particularly that particular section 19, sort of 15 through 19 or so, is about like people who you might have a problem with, right? Like someone who's like have some sort of conflict with, and yet the command is love them as yourself. Like, don't hate a brother in your heart, rather love him as yourself. And I thought, well, if they're having to give you an instruction not to hate this person in their heart, clearly this is someone you're at odds with, right? Yeah. And the text is saying, but don't do that, right? Don't hate your brother in your heart. Instead, love him as yourself. Now, importantly, that told me, like, okay, well, like Leviticus 19 is talking about enemy treatment here, in this particular text. Like, it's talking about enemy treatment. So that when Jesus comes to this and reads, okay, hey, the law says, right, you should love your enemy, but I say love your enemy. He's just expositing what I think one would extrapolate from Torah itself, particularly Leviticus 19. Now, the other question then about neighbor treatment is, yes, of course, in Leviticus 19, you get love neighbor as yourself, and then later you get, and there's a debate there as to whether that means just fellow Israelites or what, or if it just means literally someone who is proximate to you. Milgram thinks that it is probably best to take, I quote Milgram because he's a specialist on Leviticus. He thinks that particular example, that neighbor does probably refer to a fellow Israelite, and he thinks that's implied by the fact that later in Leviticus, in 19 verse 34, it says, love the stranger who's in your land, love him as well, love him as yourself. And so that if like it must imply that the neighbor up above that was probably a fellow Israelite. But my point would be to say that, yeah, not everyone necessarily took it that way. I mean, he cited a bunch of rabbinic texts, Milgram did, that also took love of neighbor as a universal. So I didn't go check all those citations. But my point is to say that it may not be sort of unique of Jesus to have said that a neighbor is just someone who's near you who needs your help and you ought to love. But it is certainly distinctive. In this particular case, that's what you get in Luke 10, right? The Good Samaritan parable. He's just the person's asked him, right, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, what's in the law? How does it read to you? Which also I love that response by Jesus. And he says, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, etc., and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus, do this and you'll live. Now the person seeking to make himself righteous or justify himself, however you might translate that, ask, who's my neighbor? And he tells this story about, right, this of all people, the Samaritan is the one. So there could be a couple things going on. One of which, though, I think, is that the one who proved to be a neighbor is the one who showed mercy, and that becomes the command, right? Show mercy, that you then therefore go and do likewise.
Yep.
And I do think, it speaks to this beating heart of so much of Jesus's ministry, of both his ministry itself and his instruction to his disciples, is to be merciful, pursue things that make for reconciliation, right? That's basic to Matthew 5, right? And all these conflicts that you might have, if a brother has something against you, right, go reconcile with him, right? And then go make your offering later, but first reconcile, which of course is what the Torah teaches as well. And so I think there's this notion of being the kind of person who pursues conciliation, or who's conciliatory, who pursues reconciliation, is both the beating heart of Jesus' ministry, because it itself is, in Jesus' instruction, the beating heart of what God is doing. He's the one. I mean, it's like Romans 5, right?
He's not reinventing.
While we were enemies, the Messiah died for us, right? I mean, he showed his love for us in that while we were hostile to him, he reconciled us, right? God pursued reconciliation with people who were hostile for him in a self-giving act. So this is, I think, basic also to Jesus' own understanding of who his Father is, right? You see this in the end of Matthew 5 again. Love your enemy, for God also has the sun and the rain shine down on good and evil alike. So it's this imitatio Dei, this imitation of God, by which is the basis upon which you should, reconcile, love your enemy, etc. And so, so it does a few things. One, it helps explain, I think, in my view, why some commandments sort of come up as much as they do, because for him they're attached to neighbor treatment, and so that's why they're significant. But also, I think it explains his, or helps again contextualize, just the pursuit of reconciliation, which is at the heartbeat of his ministry, at the heartbeat of his both his actions and his instruction, and then ultimately, right, continuing to go to the cross. I mean, he's announced this restoration, and they've rejected him. They've rejected him as the one who's really sent by God. And he says, I in my view, the way I describe it, is that he doesn't let that rejection stop him from still working to restore them. And so
forgive them, Father, for them
offers himself as a ransom, offers himself as a debt payment, right? So anyway, I think it's I think it's vital to both, of course, what Jesus teaches, but itself based in what I think he's getting from Torah itself. So that Torah is, after all, teaching you pursue this kind of reconciliation and be the kind of person who is watching out for your neighbor, which whether that's a native or not, but just the point of watch out for the people around you, right? And work to meet their needs. Which is why I love the stuff about, right, I mean, you got like the gleaning laws, right? Like don't reap the harvest of the corners of your field. Leave those for the people in need. Like that's a pretty odd law to have in there. When I think about it, right? And I think like, oh no, it's because like this is how you ought to think about the people around you. Like, not this land isn't yours, it's mine. I'm giving it to you. So when you're making those crops, they're really, right, God's saying like they're really sort of mine. So I'll let you have most of it, but leave some for those who don't have that, right? So I think that's
No,
insightful and meaningful.
it is. It's huge, and it's that underlying logic, right? Of understanding that, like Ray Lubeck is the professor of Tim Mackey, and I interviewed him 2-3 years ago. And one thing that he said that's always stuck with me is that if I come away from my reading of the Bible and don't have love for the human next to me, I've read nothing at all. And that's the heartbeat and desire that's under it. And it's so many times we get lost in these theological debates of Calvinism, Arminianism, and all these things. And it's like, I wonder if God's like, man, you guys are missing the forest for the trees. And to get to that point, personally, 20 years ago when I was in Bible college, I remember writing a paper because it was just so just crisp to me then that the focus of the Old Testament, and I was so young then, just I kept hearing it over and over again, was caring for the poor. Just every time I was reading through the Proverbs or reading through whatever, prophets, choose something. Even Isaiah talks about fasting being in relation to how it's our service to those in need. It's all these connections. So personally, I believe service and caring for the poor is something that's lacking inside our teaching of scholarship. It just is, in my opinion. In the introduction to your book, you start. No, that's not where I want to go. What I want to do, inside the introduction to your book, you start with the question from the rich young ruler. Okay, and I like that. You even talked about the gospel coalitions and their response to it. And the rich young ruler comes to him, "Teacher, what good things shall I do to obtain eternal life?" Rightfully, you critique the gospel coalitions because they're focusing on works-based salvation for this portion of scripture. But personally, I believe, we really, and I didn't see this in the intro, but I wanted to go here with it, to the end of that story where Jesus says, the young man said to him, "All of these I have observed. What do I still lack?" And Jesus said to him, "If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the proceeds to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." But when the young man heard the statement, he went away sorrowful, because he was one who had many possessions. So, Paul, I think there's so many of us who have so many possessions, and we're walking away sorrowful at this, that we've accomplished the Torah and that we get to this space. So I want to speak into this. I wondered if you could respond to Jesus' closing statement to the rich young ruler. Does the law of Moses draw our ultimate focus of loving our neighbor into these service of the less fortunate and caring for the poor? How important are these themes inside the Torah?
Yeah, they're vitally important. So for example, right, when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandments, he says, "Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself," and that then it's particularly then that his own exposition of love of neighbor as yourself would lead to, in this particular case, this guy selling his possessions and taking care of the poor, which tells me that he thinks there's some connection there, right, between love of neighbor and sort of and taking care of those around you, meeting the needs of those around you. And so it does seem to be that's intrinsic and vital to the Torah's own instructions on this particular issue. And you see that in Leviticus 19, where you get the famous statement to love your neighbor as yourself, and it's surrounded by requirements for justice toward having a fair balance and all this sort of stuff, and in surrounding context as well, the stuff that I already mentioned about sort of the gleaning of your fields, or the not harvesting all the portions of it, and so that care for your neighbor, being as vital as it is, indicates that you ought to have your neighbor in mind when you are. The examples it gives are in all the smallest details, all the way down from when you're harvesting your field, but also to when you're just doing commerce in the street, having a just balance. I think is what that's about. And that because and even the debt remission laws, right, in Deuteronomy 15, cancel each other's debts every 7 years. You just, and that even if you know that the debt remission is coming up, so every 7 years they cancel debts, and it says now if a person comes to you and asks for a loan, he says, don't think in your heart, don't have an evil heart, and think to yourself, wow, the year of remission is coming up. I don't want to give him anything because then it's just going to be canceled, in a year's time or whatever. And God says, don't do that, that would be a sin against me and against your brother, because you're closing your hand against the poor brother in your midst. So here you've got this vital, what we call, I don't know, a system or something of debt cancellation, but it has as its goal the protection of the impoverished, or at least I think that's the aspirational thing, is the protection of those who are impoverished, such that debt doesn't become cyclical and generational.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's vital. You could go on and on. There's all sorts of examples. But yeah, I mean, of course, I think it's vital both to Torah itself, and or at least in many sections of it, and then certainly to many of its expositions, both in Jesus's time and in other texts. I mean, you read, Philo will speak about it this way as well, very beautifully about sort of how God wants the law itself is sort of meant to be sort of generating. He actually uses the Greek word of from philanthropia, like this love of fellow humans, right? And particularly in taking care of them. Yep.
No, I love that, and there's so much hope that's inside that, to understand that that's the focus, is caring for the poor. Even when you go back to Jesus's, I can't remember exactly where it is, but where he's telling them, like, what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. When you fed, like, he gives us ways that we can encounter him in the real world today, right? And not a single one of those ways is waxing eloquently about your biblical theological position. Not one of them is that.
Right.
And yet that's my critique of not just modern scholarship, but Christian leaders, is that we've gotten so good at producing a sermon, a book, a paper, a Substack, and it's not that we need to let our show everybody what we're doing and all the good things, but it's that if we had our focus towards giving and service as much as we did about debating who's going to make it through what eschatological judgment, man, I think the kingdom of God would come here to earth as it is in heaven a lot faster. That's just my opinion. And I'm grateful that your book brought it up. I'm grateful that your book had so much hope filled within it to look at the Torah. We didn't even get into Pharisees. We had to skip over a lot of that because we talked, which was awesome. But like you really helped unpack so much of this glaring blinders that we put on when we come to the text, that Jesus and Paul somehow are pitted against Judaism and legalism. So I'm just grateful for it. I think this was a wonderful conversation. I think you did an incredible job with the book. So before we go, what I wanted to do is give you a chance to kind of plug anything that you're working on. You got a podcast out there right now. Definitely plug the book. We're going to have links to that and all that, but talk about what you're working on and what's coming next for you.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's well, importantly, and we had a lot of great conversation topics in this particular conversation about from the book itself, related to the spiritual warfare and restoration eschatology, which are all vital, obviously, to the book. And of course, for listeners who are like, the book's also called like Jesus and the Law of Moses. What kind of law stuff's in there? So if you're interested in some of that's in there quite a bit. Like I get into like his debates with Pharisees or whoever else on ritual purity, Sabbath legislation, like kind of nitty gritty specifics on that. So if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, that's a little bit there in the book as well. But then also that's the other podcast I do with Logan Williams, or it's the only podcast I do with Logan Williams. And actually, no, I do another one. I do one called Primary Sources. Okay, I'll tell both of them. The one with Logan Williams is called Jesus and Jewish Law, and it's sort of deep dive into Torah studies, both Torah as sort of in its own right, as interpreted in late Second Temple Judaism, but then particularly as it's exposited in the Gospels. So if you're interested in a deep dive into like Jesus's legal reasoning and his interpretation of Torah, it's got a lot of detail in there. More detail than you probably even wanted in the first place. And the other one is called Primary Sources, which I do with my colleague Lynn Koek, where we interview scholars and kind of short interviews and just talk about their work. So
that's it. You've got it. And there's a lot there to say. And you're busy too. I mean, to have the kids, you said 2, 4, and 6, and one on the way from what I heard from one of the other podcasts.
That's right. Yeah. 6-year-old, 4-year-old, 2-year-old, and one on the way in February.
Yeah, you're a busy man. I'll be praying for you.
Fun. I appreciate that. Yeah, but we love it. The kids are so fun, and yeah.
Oh yeah, fun. Man. I've got a 21-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 12-year-old. So I've kind of like on the
Yeah.
next chapter, and I
Yep,
loved
yep.
every second of what you're going through. But
Yeah.
I'll also say I love every second of where I'm at
Understood.
too. So
Understood. Yeah.
they're both sweet, man. So, but listen, I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure
Thank you.
having this conversation. I've learned a lot from digesting your book, and it's going to be added to my library as a valuable resource. So thank you for coming on the show and for all that you've done, brother.
Hey, Jason, I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for this interview and all the other great content you've put out and the great interviews you've done. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. So, audience, thank you so much for watching. I've got links to the book inside the notes. Make sure you check it out. Get this book. It's accessible. It's gonna really drive a lot of great discussion within you. It's a great resource, and you can make sure and read it. Come back, comment, tell us what you thought. But we appreciate you watching with us here today. So before we go, Paul, will you close us in prayer?
Absolutely. Sure. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time together. Thanks for this chance to talk with Jason and for those who might be watching and listening. Pray for your own grace and provision in their lives to meet whatever needs that you know about. We pray that our own hearts and minds are convicted and empowered by the Spirit to pursue the things that you would have us pursue. Justice with each other and love toward enemies. And we pray all of these things in the name of your Son who loved us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, stay tuned. The beginning is near. We are out.
Jesus, right, explicitly says, I haven't come to set aside the Torah and the prophets, but to fill them full. It's like the Torah and the laws are like a cup, but there is still more. There's still more fullness to what they're pointing to. And so the Sermon on the Mount is the point where Jesus takes the earlier laws, pushes their logic and the heartbeat of their wisdom even further.